James had always dreamed of owning a home in a quiet, safe neighborhood where his kids could play outside without worry. So when he and his wife, Lisa, found a beautiful house in a well-maintained suburban community, they thought they had found the perfect place to settle down. The streets were clean, the lawns were neatly trimmed, and every house looked picture-perfect. It felt like the ideal home. On their first day, neighbors waved politely as they unloaded boxes. Some even came by to introduce themselves. It all seemed so welcoming, but James quickly noticed something odd. Almost every conversation included a mention of the Homeowners Association, HOA, specifically its president, Karen. "She's really strict," one neighbor whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might hear. "You should read the rulebook carefully," another warned. "She fines people for the smallest things." James didn't think much of it at first. After all, having rules wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He assumed the HOA was there to keep the neighborhood looking nice and orderly. But he would soon learn that Karen didn't just enforce rules. She controlled everything. A week after moving in, James received his first notice from the HOA. A small yellow paper was taped to his door, stating that his trash cans had been left outside past 7 a.m., a violation of HOA policy. James laughed it off, thinking it must be a mistake. The trash had been picked up just 30 minutes late, but it hardly seemed like a big deal. However, the next day, another warning letter arrived. This time, it was about his front lawn. According to the HOA, his grass wasn't trimmed to the required height. James frowned. He had just mowed the lawn a few days ago. He looked around at other houses and noticed that Karen's lawn was perfectly manicured, almost as if she had measured every blade of grass. Curious, he walked over to his neighbor, an older man named Mr. Thompson. "Does the HOA always do this?" James asked, showing him the letter. Mr. Thompson sighed. "Karen does this. She likes control. She's the reason people walk on eggshells around here." James shook his head. "It's just grass." "You'd be surprised what she cares about," Mr. Thompson said. "She once fined a family because their Christmas lights were up a day past the deadline." James couldn't believe it. He thought about ignoring the warning, but then came the fine, a $50 penalty for non-compliance. That's when he realized Karen wasn't just keeping the neighborhood organized. She was running it like a personal kingdom. Still, James wasn't one to back down easily. He paid the fine but decided to push back a little. He left his mailbox in its original design instead of replacing it with the HOA's approved version. It was a small act of defiance, but in Karen's eyes, it was enough to make him an enemy. James tried to ignore Karen's strict rules, but it wasn't easy. She seemed to watch everything like a hawk. If someone parked their car even an inch over the driveway, a warning letter would appear on their door the next day. If a child left their bicycle outside for too long, there would be a fine. It was as if Karen had nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood and look for reasons to punish people. One evening, James was playing basketball with his son in their driveway. It was a simple game, just a father and son enjoying time together. But as soon as the ball bounced onto the sidewalk, Karen appeared, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "Excuse me," she said in a firm voice. "You can't play basketball in the driveway. It's against HOA rules." James wiped the sweat off his forehead and frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. It's my driveway." Karen smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "The rules are there for a reason. We don't want the neighborhood looking messy." James looked around. There was nothing messy about a father playing with his son. He had seen other kids riding bikes and playing with chalk on the sidewalks. It was a normal neighborhood activity. But Karen acted as if he had broken some serious law. "This is ridiculous," James said, shaking his head. Karen pulled out a small notepad and wrote something down. "I'll be sending you an official warning." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. The next day, James found a letter on his doorstep. It was another fine, this time for $75, for violating HOA activity rules. James was furious. He knew Karen was just trying to make his life difficult because he hadn't followed all her demands. Things only got worse from there. One morning, James woke up to find another warning, this time about his mailbox. It was the same mailbox that had been there when he bought the house, but Karen now claimed it didn't meet the approved community design. She demanded that he replace it immediately or face a $100 fine. James refused. "This is getting out of hand," he told Lisa. "I'm not changing a perfectly good mailbox just because she says so." A few days later, Karen sent an official HOA violation notice stating that if James didn't replace the mailbox, he could face further fines or legal action. James started noticing that other neighbors were afraid of Karen. They followed the rules, not because they agreed with them, but because they didn't want trouble. Some even whispered about how Karen had forced one family to repaint their house twice because she didn't like the shade of blue they chose. It was clear now. Karen didn't just enforce the rules. She enjoyed controlling people. But James wasn't going to back down so easily. It was a peaceful evening, and James had just finished dinner with his family. The kids were getting ready for bed, and Lisa was cleaning up the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, until James smelled something strange. It was a burning smell, faint at first, but growing stronger by the second. He walked toward the garage, where the smell was coming from. As soon as he opened the door, his eyes widened in shock. Thick smoke was pouring out. Flames were already crawling up the walls, lighting up the space with an eerie orange glow. "Lisa, get the kids outside now," James shouted. Lisa ran upstairs, grabbed the children, and rushed out the front door. James grabbed a fire extinguisher and tried to put out the flames, but it was too late. The fire was spreading too fast. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. James ran outside, coughing, as a neighbor shouted, "I already called 911. The fire truck is on its way." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The flashing red and blue lights of the fire truck could be seen at the entrance of the neighborhood. James felt a small wave of relief. Help was here. But then something unbelievable happened. The fire truck stopped at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. The firefighters were trying to drive in, but something was blocking the road. James squinted through the smoke and gasped in disbelief. Karen's car was parked right in the middle of the street. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, arguing with the firefighters. "You can't drive in here," she was saying. "This is a private HOA road, and heavy vehicles will damage it." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. His house was burning down, and Karen was worried about the road. He ran toward her, shouting, "Move your car, Karen. The fire department needs to get through." Karen didn't even look concerned. "I'm just following HOA rules," she said coldly. "We have weight limits on vehicles. Your house fire is unfortunate, but that's not my problem." James felt his blood boil. "Are you serious? My family could have been trapped inside." The lead firefighter was losing patience. "Ma'am, if you don't move your car, we'll have no choice but to push it out of the way." Karen gasped, acting as if she was the victim. "You wouldn't dare. I'll report you to the HOA board." James had had enough. He looked at his neighbors, who were standing nearby, horrified at what was happening. Without hesitation, two of them rushed forward to help James. Together, they pushed Karen's car out of the way. The moment the path was clear, the fire truck raced toward the burning house, but James couldn't shake the sick feeling in his stomach. Too much time had already been lost. And the worst part, Karen wasn't done yet. James stood on the sidewalk, his heart pounding as he watched the firefighters rush toward his burning house. Thick black smoke filled the sky, and bright flames roared inside. The heat was intense, and every passing second felt like an eternity. The firefighters worked quickly, unrolling hoses and spraying water onto the fire. They smashed windows to release the smoke and tried to control the flames before they spread further. But James could tell it was too late. If they had arrived just a few minutes earlier, maybe more could have been saved. But because of Karen's selfish actions, those minutes were wasted. James turned to face Karen, who was now standing with her arms crossed, watching everything unfold like it wasn't her fault. "This is because of you," James shouted, his voice filled with anger. "You wasted time arguing while my house was on fire." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Your house would have burned anyway. Maybe if you had better wiring, this wouldn't have happened." James clenched his fists. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Instead of apologizing, Karen was blaming him for the fire. The neighbors who had gathered to watch were just as shocked and furious. One woman stepped forward. "Karen, do you even hear yourself? You blocked the fire truck and almost made things worse." Karen lifted her chin. "I was only following HOA rules. The fire department should have requested permission before bringing in their heavy truck. This road is new, and we can't afford damages." Another neighbor shook his head. "You care more about the road than James' house." Karen shrugged. "The HOA has standards to maintain. If people actually followed the rules, we wouldn't have problems like this." James was boiling with anger, but he knew arguing with Karen wouldn't change anything. Instead, he turned back toward his house, watching as the flames slowly died down. After nearly an hour of work, the fire was finally under control. But the damage was severe. Half of the house was destroyed. A firefighter walked up to James. "The good news is, no one was hurt," he said. "But I won't lie to you. The structure is badly damaged. You'll need to talk to your insurance company as soon as possible." James nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. This was supposed to be his dream home, and now it was in ruins. As if things weren't bad enough, Karen cleared her throat and spoke again. "I expect you to clean this up quickly," she said. "We can't have burned down houses ruining our neighborhood's image. I'll be sending you a notice about the mess." James turned and stared at her in disbelief. His house had just been destroyed, and she was already treating it like an inconvenience. He didn't know how, but one thing was clear. Karen had to be stopped. James stood outside his burned-down house, feeling a mix of exhaustion and anger. The fire was finally out, but half of his home was destroyed. The walls were blackened with smoke, the windows shattered, and the roof had partially collapsed. It didn't feel real. Just a few hours ago, this was the place where he and his family laughed, ate dinner, and felt safe. Now, it was nothing but a burned wreck. Lisa stood beside him, holding their two kids, who were still shaken from the fire. Neighbors murmured in disbelief, shaking their heads at the terrible damage. Everyone knew who was to blame, not for the fire itself, but for making things worse. Karen. James turned to look at her, expecting at least a small sign of guilt or regret. But she just stood there, arms crossed, acting as if this was just another small inconvenience for the neighborhood. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Karen pulled out her clipboard and sighed dramatically. "James, we need to discuss something important." James blinked. "Are you serious? My house just burned down." Karen ignored his frustration. "Yes, but now we have a problem. This burned house is an eyesore for the neighborhood. According to HOA rules, damaged properties must be repaired immediately to maintain property values." James felt his blood boil. An eyesore. His home was gone, and all she cared about was the appearance of the street. Lisa, who had been quiet this whole time, finally snapped. "Karen, we just lost half our house. Have some sympathy." Karen shrugged. "I understand this is difficult for you, but we can't let emotions interfere with the rules. You'll need to have repairs started within 2 weeks, or we'll have to fine you for neglecting your property." James clenched his fists. "You blocked the fire truck. If they had gotten here sooner, maybe there wouldn't be this much damage." Karen smirked. "Oh, please. If anyone is to blame, it's you. You should have taken better care of your house. Maybe if your electrical system was up to HOA standards, this wouldn't have happened. A wave of outrage swept through the crowd. Unbelievable, one neighbor muttered. This is too much, another person said. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But inside, he was boiling with anger. Karen had caused a delay in the fire response, and now she had the audacity to blame him for what happened. Before James could say another word, another surprise arrived. His insurance adjuster. "Mr. James," the man said, flipping through some paperwork, "we need to assess the damages. But I have to be honest with you, this will take time. Insurance claims for fires don't process overnight." James sighed. "How long?" "Months," the man admitted. James felt sick. Months. Where would his family go in the meantime? And knowing Karen, she wouldn't wait a single day before making things even worse. But James wasn't going to let her win. James sat on the front steps of his burned-down house, staring at the wreckage. The smell of smoke and ash still lingered in the air. Lisa had taken the kids to a friend's house for the night, but James stayed behind, unable to walk away from what was left of their home. He felt tired, frustrated, and angry, but most of all, he felt determined. Karen had crossed every possible line. First, she blocked the fire truck, wasting precious minutes that could have saved more of the house. Then, she had the nerve to blame him for the fire and demand that he fix everything immediately or face fines. It was clear now. She wasn't just following rules. She was abusing her power, and James was done putting up with it. The next morning, James made 2 important phone calls. The first was to the local news station. The second was to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. By the afternoon, things started moving fast. A news crew arrived, cameras in hand, ready to cover the unbelievable story. James stood in front of his burned house, explaining everything. The fire, the delay, Karen's refusal to move her car, and her outrageous demands after the disaster. Neighbors gathered around, eager to share their own experiences. One by one, they spoke out against Karen. "She fines us for everything," one woman said. "She once made me repaint my fence because she didn't like the color." Another man added, "The worst part is, no one stands up to her." "Mr. Thompson," the elderly neighbor said, "we're all afraid she'll make our lives miserable." James turned to face the camera. "She already made my life miserable," he said, "but I won't let her do it to anyone else." Karen, of course, was furious when she saw the news crew. She stormed out of her house, yelling at the reporters, "You can't be here. This is private property." But it was too late. The cameras were rolling, and the story was already being broadcast to the entire city. Later that evening, James got a call from his lawyer. "I've reviewed your case," the lawyer said. "There's clear negligence on Karen's part. By blocking emergency vehicles, she violated local laws. We can take legal action." James smiled for the first time in days. "Let's do it." By the next morning, the story had gone viral. People all over the country were talking about the HOA president who blocked a fire truck. Even local officials took notice. Karen had always acted like she was untouchable, but now, the whole world knew what she had done. And for the first time, she had something to fear. James woke up to a flood of messages and phone calls. Overnight, his story had spread across the internet. People were outraged that an HOA president had blocked a fire truck and then blamed the homeowner for the disaster. The news stations continued to cover the story, and social media was filled with comments from people across the country. "This is unbelievable," one person wrote. "She needs to be removed from the HOA immediately," another commented. As James scrolled through the messages, his phone buzzed with a call from his lawyer. "We have good news," the lawyer said. "The city council is now involved. Blocking emergency vehicles is a serious offense. Karen could face legal consequences for what she did." James felt a rush of relief. Finally, Karen was being held accountable. Later that afternoon, James went outside and saw something surprising. Karen's car was gone. Normally, she would have been patrolling the neighborhood, looking for the smallest rule violations. But today, her house was dark and silent. "Where is she?" Lisa asked as she walked up beside him. James shrugged. Maybe she finally realized she messed up. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat so easily. The next day, a letter arrived in James' mailbox. It was from the HOA. His heart sank as he read it. "Due to the damages to your property, you are in violation of HOA appearance standards. If repairs do not begin within 7 days, you will face a daily fine of $200. James clenched his jaw. Even after everything, Karen was still trying to punish him. But this time, James wasn't alone. Later that evening, a group of neighbors knocked on his door. "We've had enough," one of them said. "We're tired of Karen controlling everything. We want her removed from the HOA board." James felt a spark of hope. Together, they started organizing a petition. If enough homeowners signed it, they could hold a vote to remove Karen from her position. As they went door to door, more and more people eagerly signed their names. "I've wanted her gone for years," one man admitted. "She made me replace my front door because she didn't like the design," another woman said. By the end of the night, they had more than enough signatures. The petition was official. A meeting was scheduled, and the entire neighborhood was ready to finally take action. James looked at the list of names and felt something he hadn't in a long time. Victory was finally within reach. Karen had ruled the neighborhood for too long. But this time, she wouldn't win. The day of the HOA meeting had finally arrived. The neighborhood's community hall was packed with homeowners, many of whom had never attended a meeting before. But this time, everyone had a reason to be there. At the front of the room, Karen sat with her usual confident smirk, acting as if nothing was wrong. She tapped her clipboard against the table, waiting for the meeting to start. James took a deep breath and stepped forward. He wasn't alone. Several of his neighbors stood beside him, holding the petition with all the signatures. Lisa whispered, "We're ready." James nodded and raised his voice. "We, the homeowners of this community, are calling for a vote of no confidence against Karen as HOA president." The room erupted in applause. Karen's smirk faded instantly. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "I have done nothing wrong. Everything I do is for the good of the neighborhood." James stepped closer, meeting her glare. "You blocked a fire truck from reaching my burning house. You wasted valuable time arguing over the road while my home was being destroyed." Several people in the crowd shouted in agreement. And instead of apologizing, James continued, "You tried to fine me for the damage. You care more about rules and power than about the people living here." Karen stood up sharply. "That is not true. But she was interrupted by an HOA board member who cleared his throat. "The homeowners have spoken, Karen. We now have to hold a vote." Karen's face turned red with anger, but there was nothing she could do. The ballots were passed around, and one by one, homeowners cast their votes. Minutes later, the results were in. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. The room exploded with cheers. People clapped, neighbors hugged, and James finally felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Karen, meanwhile, stood frozen in shock. "You can't do this," she cried. "I built this HOA. I make the rules." One of the board members gave her a firm look. "Not anymore." With no other choice, Karen grabbed her things and stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. A few days later, James received another important call from the city council. "Mr. James, after reviewing the situation, we've decided to press legal charges against Karen for obstructing emergency services. She may also face fines for violating local laws." James couldn't believe it. Justice was finally being served. As he hung up the phone, he looked at his burned house. It would take time to rebuild, but at least now, he could do it without fear of Karen making things worse. Lisa walked up and smiled. "We did it," she said. James nodded. "Yeah, we won." The nightmare was over, and with Karen gone, the neighborhood was finally a home again.